Governor Martin.
Okay, with that, we'll call the Strategic Planning, Academic, and System Oversight Committee to order. First item will be the approval of minutes.
So moved.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the minutes. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, the next item will be the Medical Education Subcommittee, and Governor Carol Roberts is the chair of that team. Governor Roberts.
Thank you, Chairman Martin. When the Board of Governors approved the 2 new medical schools, we did so with the understanding that those approvals would be considered in the context of a multifaceted plan for medical education in the state of Florida. One which would consider residencies and the resource base for the existing medical schools. We gave at that time, we were very specific that we would do it in the context of medical education for the state. As everyone well knows, the economics of our nation and our state are very different from what they were at the time of our approval of the medical education resolution. For this reason, it is more important than ever that we monitor the health of our new and our existing programs, that we understand their funding, and that, if appropriate, we consider changes which will improve their chances for optimal funding. As our agenda indicates, 3 separate initiatives bring medical education funding to the forefront at this time: potential legislation, a PAGA report, and the SUS President's Task Force chaired by President Manchin. At this time, I'm going to ask President Manchin to begin this discussion, and that he will be followed by Dr. Lamont to take us through the issues of medical education funding so that we can have some healthy discussions. This item today is for discussion only, and no formal action will be taken. President Manchin.
Thank you, Governor Roberts. I would refer you to the recommendations and report in the materials handed out for strategic planning, academic oversight. This is a document starting on page 19. First of all, let me just say that I can tell you that Governor Edwards and Governor Roberts selected me or appointed me to take this responsibility on, knowing that it would be the board who would make the decisions there, with RE providing incredible support. And I'd also like to introduce Russ Armistead, the Associate Vice President for Finance and Planning for the Office of the Senior Vice President for Health at the University of Florida. Russ is here with us as well. These 2 gentlemen provided the labor to try to put something down. I'm not sure, before you get to the numbers, maybe we ought to talk about what we're trying to do from a strategic, let's start at 30,000 before we get to 500 feet. First issue was relatively simple. Should we think about a staff position at the Board of Governors to focus on this growing and critical part of the educational mission of the state? It's our feeling that that is a good idea, but in light of the current economic trends, we think that it needs to be tabled until better times. But long term, when you have 5 functioning medical schools under your umbrella, you're going to need somebody spending basically full time keeping their eyes on it and working out issues between them and among them. So that was our feeling, that it was just not the time to deal with that. The second issue has to do with medical school funding. When the Board of Governors voted on approval of or recommending the 2 new medical schools, they also voted to insist that there be equity of funding across all the medical schools in the state system. And that was a 2-part motion, and that has become very important as we move forward. And basically what Ari and Russ and I have tried to do is to just put on the table the issues that need to be sorted out before the board gets to the place where it's comfortable saying that we think this is how this ought to be handled. And that gets to be very mechanical. But the fundamental question we have to come to is that I'm not talking about startup costs or unique expenses that are incurred by the medical school, but it is in the state's best interest, we believe, to have a standard funding formula for medical students, so that a medical student in Miami would get the same amount of state support as a medical student in Orlando or Boca Raton or Tampa or Gainesville or Tallahassee. So that's sort of the 30,000 strategic issue that I would hope is hard to argue against. The devil will be in the details of how you get there, and I think we'll all have to be very careful as we move that forward. But when we're through with ramp up and when we're fully operational, seems to me the state interests are served by having a standard approach to funding the basic direct costs of medical education. So, Madam Subcommittee Chair, recommendations 2 through 7 get us to more specifics about that, and I'm comfortable, unless there are questions right now, turning it over to Dr. Lamont for further discussion.
So, Dr. Lamont? And after his brief presentation, we certainly would like to entertain conversation and discussion, because it's an important issue for our entire system.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will be brief. As President Matchin said, I believe that the issues can be wrapped into really a few critical words. Number one, do we have a system of funding medical education in the state that is equitable across all of our schools, old schools, new schools? One thing that Dean German has taught me is that if you've seen one medical school, you've seen one medical school. They're all very different, and especially the new ones are quite different with needed front-end funding. Secondly, do we have a system of funding that is transparent so that we can understand it, or so that the legislature can understand it? And third, do we have a system that is in the long term sustainable for both the new schools and for the existing schools? What we are proposing, what the legislation is proposing, as President Matchin said, is the notion of a standard level of funding. Here is how, at a dirt simple level, it might work. If you take the American Association of Medical Colleges study from 1995 and you prorate its average cost of instruction for a medical school student to the year 2009, you will get to a national average of $64,908. Call it $64,000. That's for one student. If you were to take that figure and as a Board of Governors, as a legislature, working with the legislature, were to say, Florida will use as its base a national average. Or perhaps the legislature would say, well, looking at the numbers, we would support 80% of the national average, not quite the 64,000 or whatever, but some base figure. We believe there is such a figure. And you were to take that figure and you were to multiply it simply by the head count of your program. You were to take the tuition of your program, multiply that by the head count, and subtract that from that. You would have a form of base funding that would be across all institutions understandable. You would have programs that, you would certainly have medical education programs that had in excess of those dollars. You may have programs that needed more to get up to that. But that's the first issue, I think, is to understanding what is in our medical schools. Frankly, OPAGA had a really difficult time trying to understand how the schools were funded, and when you don't understand how they're funded, you are at risk, because what happens is faculty practice plans then are at risk to augment, or not even augment, but to replace state funding, and that, to some extent, is what has happened in Florida. So we believe that there is a way to put something in place that is more sustainable and rational, and that can be compared across institutions and would be viable into the future. Madam Chair.
Excuse me. I'm sorry. Thank you very much, R.E. I'd like to have discussion from the other schools that are involved, the medical school, representatives of the medical schools. President Hitt, your comments?
I think that getting to a standard funding methodology as suggested by President Matchett in the report would be a good step forward. I don't know what the right number is any more than probably most others do. I suspect we'll end up coming to some compromise, based on the national average or something like it. Obviously, that poses a problem. We'd all understand for the new medical schools, we'll begin with small enrollments and we have to staff up, so we would be looking for funding for the FTE we have starting next year, but enough money to bridge the gap between what we need and what we can justify with FTE until we're fully enrolled. With that caveat, I think this is a real step forward, and I would endorse the plan wholeheartedly.
President, I think we all understand that, President.
Madam Chair, I have been in places that had to ramp up new enterprises, and they will probably, you probably have a projected full enrollment, don't you, John?
It's 120 per class before 8.
Yeah, so whatever we turn out, you blow it up, and that's where their funding level ought to be, and then you come to some agreement, recognizing that there'll be times when you'll need, it's not just a one-fourth, because you got to front end some of this stuff.
Exactly.
But at the end, it'll be very simple, if we could ever get to the point of understanding what level funding is, to come up with the ramp-up number for John.
And we probably would, at every medical school, there'd be something that's a little different, but, we do that with our general programs now. We have a per FTE funding base, but then different universities have different programs that get funding that's negotiated on a different basis. I would assume that would be true with medical schools and dental schools and other professions.
That's the diversity we seek to serve the state.
Yeah.
But as long as, it will help the Board of Governors, I would suggest, to know that you're looking at a special thing and not a base thing. When it gets confusing and when it's all wrapped into one package.
Right.
Yeah. I believe it would be very helpful to us. I mean, if we could come to some understanding on how we will agree on this number. Dr. Haney, I know you can help us.
Thank you. Pat Haney, University of South Florida. We absolutely concur with the proposal. We have had the opportunity to work with the staff at UF and with Dr. Lamont, and we believe that this is a very reasonable approach. And as we were talking about this and working on the analysis, the presumption that we all held as staff working on it was that it was for an established college and that there would be specific considerations as a school is emerging, because as has been pointed out, they don't straight line. So there will clearly be a particular year, particularly the early years, that their expenses would be quite different than when the school is established. So we certainly applaud the recommendations and look forward to having the opportunity to work to finalize exactly what those numbers look like.
Thank you, Dr. Haney.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
How long do you think it takes to call a school staff? Because in our system, when I'm thinking about it, by the time we finally get there, the 4 or 5 years is probably going to be here. So we probably don't have to spend a lot of time working about the quarter to quarter to quarter. I mean, just realistically, when it comes next year, we've just seen what the numbers are. I don't think that'll happen. But 5 years...
Well, I think the accrediting agencies define that, isn't it, John? When you're not fully accredited until you graduate your first class. So, I mean, it won't be hard to figure out, and I'm sure they already have a business plan about how many they're going to take until they ramp up.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's
But
all.
from our point of view, probably 5 years, you and that 5 years would be at the same funding level as University of Florida, let's say, USF?
Let our, if you would, allow our medical dean to comment on that. She can tell you when she'll get full enrollment.
Full enrollment will come when the first class that has 120 students in it graduates. Not when the first class graduates, because first class will have only 40. And that will actually be in 2017, because at that time we will have 120 students in the first, second, third, and fourth years of medical school. So we'll have a full complement of faculty. So I hope...
So it is much farther than what I said.
It is farther
But
than...
the gap gets very small in the out years. I mean, it's big now because we'll have 40 students and we'll have to have about 4/5 of the total budget we projected, if I recall correctly, in German.
Yes,
But it narrows quickly as you add more to the entering classes and they progress.
it's heavily funded on the front end because most of the costs are fixed costs, not variable costs. You have to have the entire faculty to teach the first year. You add additional faculty for small groups, but the fixed costs are much greater than the variable costs, so most of the money is shifted down into the early years.
Any other questions? Dr. Judy?
I guess I have a question out of naivete. We're talking about extra funding to ramp up new programs.
I'm sorry.
We're talking about extra funding needed to ramp up new programs versus the funding needed for established programs. Is there not some point in time when established programs would need some sort of supplemental funding to account for aging of equipment, faculty retiring and having to bring on new folks at higher salaries?
It shouldn't be. I mean, we've been around, speaking now for one established program. Those problems are going to exist every year. The problem you get into, and we're in it, is that our funding has slipped so low that we are being called to task by the accreditors. And so that creates somewhat of a problem for you and has to be addressed. But absent something like that, we think that, and I really think the accreditors would be willing to work with all of us if they knew there was a formula coming down. And everyone knows that if we've got limited dollars in a particular year, that we have to decide to divert to the new ones on that time. But everyone needs to have a comfort level that when we get to some point down the road, there's going to be equity of funding. And I think that's a huge issue for the accrediting agencies.
Dr. Friedland, did you want to comment?
Thank you for the opportunity. I would agree with the concept, and I think we're all, regardless of whether we're an independent school or whether we're a branch campus, have the same funding problems, and the accrediting agencies are concerned globally. It's not just what's happening in Florida. It's now what's happening on a national basis. So I think we would, be taking a very important step, and perhaps a leadership step, to go to a uniform funding system for all schools, or at least a formula funding system for medical schools. And I think that'd be a very appropriate thing for us to do.
Yes, sir.
How do we square this? If we do this for medical schools, how do we,
It's on.
how do we square this with, let's say, funding for other types of programs in the university system? And I just question that. Are we picking out some group and giving them special treatment versus another group, that maybe biotech or something like that comes in and says, well, we need to have it because we're ramping up when we're doing it. Do we have a problem there? Have you addressed that at all, President Mason?
I would say, since I don't have to do it, I think it's a good idea to do it for all of them, but
Only if you'll chair.
No, but I think you could make a case. This is your most expensive party And this is the one you better get control of, or it's going to bankrupt everything else. And then I think you could make a good case that certain kinds of degrees ought to have a state funding level that transmits across institutions, regardless of institutional type. But it's just not that simple, because it's not 5, it'll be 11. And in some fields, with state colleges coming into the field, it'll be 25 to 30. But philosophically, I think the board ought to think about that as a long-term strategy to try to come with some equity issues, thinking now about what's best for the state, and assuming, as I am, that tuition is going to be deregulated to provide for the variability that will inevitably be between institutions.
Chairman?
I have one question. I think maybe Dr. Lamont could respond to this, but in some of the literature that I've been reading and leading up to this, it's been my understanding that this type of having a medical school funding formula is very standard across the country, that it's usual for that to be the case as opposed to the exception.
Except I don't know any state that's got 5 medical schools to figure out.
Well,
but I mean, if you got one medical school, it's great to have a formula for that one. But we've got a much more complex problem here, actually.
I didn't see that. I was going to ask that. Is there a state that, or any, where we can look at that does it that way?
Madam Chair, it's a good question, and I don't really think that there's an answer that would corroborate that there are states out there. First of all, Florida does have this unusual situation in that we're building some new schools right now, as are other states. However, when OPACA did its study, it was really unable to find any state in the union that had a good handle on how medical education was being funded and what the accountability was for those dollars. And we are in the same boat there. If you look at the appropriation to the University of Florida Health Science Center and compare it with UCF's or with FSU, you just really can't compare them, period, because they're such apples and oranges. And so I don't think there is a method. There is a sense out there of a need to do something, I think, from AAMC on this issue for the last 15 or 20 years even.
It's possible I picked that up in connection with Representative Proctor's legislation. It may have been something someone said in support of the bill.
Governor Tripp, I think President Manchin said is right as to other degrees. In the medical schools, there's going to be much more of a commonality. Even in, say, an engineering program, the University of Florida and the University of North Florida are just different. You know, they're putting out graduates, but the kind of research, the cost of the labs are going to be more expensive at some places than others, and so it's probably going to be a lot harder to translate.
My question to you, thank you, President Lady. My question to you, President Manchin, I think we need to have a time certain that we can come up with a number, because as so often with any body, the Board of Governors may be guilty of this over the years, I take the blame, we need a time that we can come up with this number, or a formula, because it will drag on forever if we don't.
Well, I think before we wade into the details, we need I would personally want this board to say they're going to go there, because it's going to take some wrangling to get a number that we can all sign off on. But I think we can do it. But you all have to tell us that you want it to happen. This is just a proposal from a subgroup you created, and then you give us a date certain, and we will try to meet it.
I think it's very important that we do that we go past a conversation. Obviously, you would chair the committee, working with the staff.
That's not obvious.
President Manchin, you've done such a good job, and I think that the presidents with already staffing it would have to come back with us with a number. It isn't going to be easy to do. We recognize that.
Well, I can tell you, you'll have all the schools' attention if they know that something's going to happen. You know, one of the problems we've had so far is we've sort of been in and out of are we going to do it and are we not going to do it. If you say it's going to happen, I can be pretty comfortable that the people that need to look at it are going to look at it.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Governor Edwards, and then I'm going to talk with this chair, I'm going to talk with that chairman publicly right now and come up with a time frame.
I have one disagreement with President Mason, that I think could be fixed. And that is, I think your idea, and I've read this material, impressed with it, but I think the mistake is not figuring out a way to fund the person on staff who's going to lead us to the next step in finality.
Well, our problem
Even if we ask each of the medical schools to commit some small dollar to win that issue. Because I think if we had, just like we recommended, that person solely focused on making this happen, we get there faster. Because truthfully, you've done a great job sharing, but you've got a big institution to run. You know, this can only take so much of your day, and even with the deans of the schools. So I think that I'd like to see us work out a way where the medical schools commit some dollars that would help to fund this person, and we consider that if we're going to go forward.
I think, Dr. Sir, you make a very good point, and everyone at the table agrees that there's a need, but we have a few issues with money.
Well, I would ask for a contribution.
But we're desperately trying to get extra money for not just the two new ones, but the two most
But you know what,
mature.
this is spending good money to get better money, okay? And my concern is, I've seen this, if we just continue on with the committee situation, we'll be down the road and we'll still be fighting with you.
So you make a very good point. Governor Edwards.
I'm not sure I thought this day would come when we all seem to be on the same page. I also...
We haven't heard from all of them yet.
Pardon me. State would like to be heard from first.
Please continue, sir. So go there.
I also have been screaming, and if there's anybody that knows what the responsibility of a board-level person would be, it's Pat Haney, who I believe has been involved in this over a number of years. I don't know what the cost of this extra person would be. In terms of the budgets that we're looking at, it can't be that much. I recognize...
Maybe it's a loaner from something. You got a loaner chancellor.
And you get what you pay for.
I got my audit charter done by getting a loaner from the University of Florida to do it. I mean, you know, there's ways to do it.
Well, with that said, and I agree with Norm on that. However, I also would defer to the committee. I think certainly it is a tough time to ask for any additional funding. I would hope that they might be able to figure out a way among themselves in their various meetings to discuss this issue. Because I believe firmly that, and strongly, that if we are going to achieve the objections that I believe this board set for our medical schools, all of them, the funding formula is essential, number one. And number two, you ask about have other states done it, and the answer apparently is no. If we're going to be the leader in medical education in the United States and in the country, let the other states follow our example. And I think it's a perfect example to follow. Hopefully, if we're here, or when we're here, if I'm here next year, at budget time, things might be a little better. But I would certainly encourage the group to continue to look for a way to fund that position. Do we need a motion to approve the concept, Madam Chair?
After we'd like Judy to speak, what I would like to suggest, if we have a motion to approve a concept and a timeline that we all agree on, then we'll let President Delaney, with his skills, work out with our staff available and the presidents of the universities that have medical schools how we will staff it. So if we can have a concept
That
a
would be the,
timeline, do you think,
recommendation.
first, Governor, before you do that, Judy, would you like to speak?
Yeah, and it's to this point, there's a House bill in our packet that basically says we'll do this. It doesn't have a timeline, but it says to get money, we're going to have a per-student basis funding, et cetera, et cetera. What's the status of this?
The status of this report?
This House bill that's in here.
Yeah.
There's a House bill that basically, whether we like it or not, says we're going to do it.
It's come out of Bill Faulkner's committee, it passed out of committee, and that's, the next step to the floor if it's heard. Is that correct?
It does have a deadline, so, but, I mean, this is happening.
Right. But I think this board takes, yes, it may, but I think this board's responsibility is to step up and have a timeline. The president can help us with that, and approve this, and then ask, President Delaney to work with all, does that make sense?
I think we've got the sense of the board that this is considered important, so we'll go back with the staff and see what we can wrap up the way to approach it.
Do we need a motion to
I don't think we
support
need a
it?
motion. I think we've got to.
And you'll find out about everything. And will report back to us on the timeline, so we can assume by the next meeting, because if we don't, we'll just be talking about it. Yes, sir.
Would it be possible for you to consider accepting the recommendations of the 7 recommendations?
That's what I was gonna move.
Yes, sir.
But some of them have
I would like to
significant...
amend to change the first recommendation, though.
Well, wait, we don't have
Which is
a,
not to have the staff person.
well, we're accepting a report, is what we're
Okay,
accepting.
I'm just saying, there's some recommendations in here that will be useful as we work with legislative staff who have different understandings about some of these issues.
I think that's very appropriate, President Manchin. Governor Edwards?
Yeah, I would move all 7 recommendations. And on my understanding exactly what you're saying, my suggestion there would be, let's give the staff and the chancellor and the committees an opportunity to see if they can't resolve that for us.
Well, why don't we move it with the idea that we have some feelings that staff ought to be there? You know, instead of just saying we accept that, because that'll fight us down the road. I mean,
Restate your motion, sir.
I'm looking at recommendation 1 now.
That's pretty simple.
Okay, I would move that we approve all 7 recommendations with the further, and further that we would hope that recommendation 1 could be implemented as soon as possible. I mean, yeah, that the staff position could be implemented as soon as possible. And that
Is there a
says we're
second?
for it, but we don't have to have it if we can't figure out.
Is there a
what's wrong.
second? Is there any discussion for our board members or the presidents or Dr. Haney, anyone that participates to the motion?
Clarification, as long as we're
Going down this change line on recommendation 1, I think the adjustment that Governor Edwards has made was to say we hope that we can fill the position soon. The language in recommendation 1 says until the economy improves, and I think what we're trying to say is
The sooner the better.
we would certainly recommend that whether or not the economy improves, we're asking President and Resident Delaney to work with staff to see if there's a way to fill it whether or not the economy improves. So I just want the minister to reflect that.
I mean, the reality is, we're going to get a budget within the next 60 days.
Right.
We may not be able to fund even what we've got, much less something new, but we've sensed the priority here. and
Yeah, I just want to make sure that...
Right.
maybe we can get a lend to somebody to make it
And,
work, because it benefits them.
Yeah, no, I just want to make sure that it's clear the sense of the board isn't wait till the economy improves.
Yeah,
If there's a way to work around, we want to work
Well,
around.
after this
technically, if
passes, I
we're
would-
approving this, we should just amend that and strike delayed until the economy approves and say implemented as soon as possible. Then there's no question.
I think my recommendation would be that you simply vote to accept the report, and I think we've got the sense of the board from this conversation.
Yes.
Then I would, after this passes, I would move that we request the University of South Florida loan us Pat back again.
She sold her home, but she can have our loan.
Call the question.
Yes, all in favor? Opposed?
So did we also vote on the recommendation as suggested by the chancellor?
Now, this is
Just to accept the report.
the report, yes.
Is the board going to give us a sense of when they'd like this formula put forth?
I think, don't you, would you just think?
We'll work with you.
You'll work with him, we'll come.
About something.
Because I think what the board is going to have to take formal action on the formula itself and the whole thing. And we didn't notice that we were going to get into nitty-gritty details and take action today. So I want to make sure that we have the opportunity to have the proper notice and the proper people here to discuss. But we did hear from several of the universities. I think there were two that we didn't get, that didn't pipe up, so I think we better get them on the record.
And this will be a interesting act. Provost Abel will be right now.
I would like Chairman McDevitt to have our proxy.
And President Laney will be in touch, but for our timeline, I think it's something that we certainly need to have this in place long before, I would think, by fall, but we will come back. Would he work with you with a specific timeline? Because presidents are so easy to work with and come together on agreement, right?
But if the bill passes and stipulates a timeline,
Yes, it does.
don't we need to sort of make some decision
No, I think
sooner rather than
fine.
later, so that we could maybe, if our timeline isn't consistent with what they're thinking about adding into the bill,
I just let the staff work this out and put everything in sense
make
is
sure
what my
that it gets
recommendation
into
is.
the bill, so.
And Bill Proctor is certainly a wonderful friend of the university system and this board, and we will work with him to make certain that we follow the timeline of his bill. Thank you very much. Thank
And
all
just
of
for the
you.
record, we do support it. We support the action and we'll participate in it.
That's well said. Thank you. That was
The
nice.
minutes can reflect, Mikey.
Yeah.
Put that in as a direct quote, and I'll take that proxy, okay?
Thank you very much.
Give me
Chairman
Mitch's.
Martin.
Is there anyone here from FIU that wants to speak to this?
Gene Rock was here this morning, but I don't see him.
Not being here, that obviously means they support it.
Mitch was there with him. Thank you.
Okay, moving right along, that was a discussion item, but we took action, which is good. I'm glad to see that we're moving forward and we are being aggressive here. The next item, we will have Governor Parker to discuss the baccalaureate degrees and the system structure. Governor Parker.
Governor Parker, you're up.
Do we want to go finish this committee or go back to the other one? I was doing it. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin, or Governor Martin, excuse me. One of the Forward by Design projects our board adopted was to increase the number of distance education degrees with a special emphasis on high state needs in cooperation with community colleges and not-for-profit independent colleges and universities. Last year, the legislature also focused...
They can't hear you, Ava, so
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Last year, the legislature also focused on distance learning and created a distance learning task force to review and make recommendations on various issues. The task force has submitted its report to the legislature, our board, and other interested parties. Mikey sent you a copy of the report about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Your agenda packet contains the executive summary of the report, and I've asked President Hitt, who co-chaired the task force, to focus on its highlights for us. After his presentation, we will discuss the recommendations of the task force and how we can best use this information to move our projects forward. Dr. Hitt, would you and your team present the report to us, please?
Well, thank you, Governor Parker. Starting on page 45 of the committee agenda, you'll find an executive summary of the Florida Distance Learning Task Force report. The recommendations in the report and the executive summary are divided into subsidy policy issues and fiscal policy recommendations. The report may appear somewhat anticlimactic in that it promotes continuing and enhancing many of the activities our colleges and universities have been engaged in for the past 7 years. But the reality is that in sheer numbers of distance learning programs and students, Florida is consistently ahead of other states because it has pursued a cooperative approach to statewide coordination rather than a centralized virtual university approach. The task force had a long list of study assignments which are included in Appendix B of the full report. The major issues can be seen on the slide that's up now. In approaching its assignment, the task force used these principles as a guide in its deliberation. Increase access for undergraduate degree completion, promote cost efficiency, review existing policies and activities, build a coordinated system based on existing strengths, and maintain local institutional control for distance learning. What I'd like to do is first talk briefly about the importance of this report to the state university system, and then I'll ask John Oper and Richard Stevens to highlight some of the key recommendations. The slide that's up now makes two important points. First, distance learning is no longer an ancillary operation in higher education. A larger proportion of courses offered each year have some component of distance learning. A larger number of degree programs offered include opportunities for completing courses through distance learning. Distance learning serves both the traditional on-campus student and the non-traditional adult off-campus students. As an instructional delivery mode, it's becoming commonplace in higher education. Students often use a buffet-style approach to enrolling, choosing both classroom and distance learning courses to complete their degree. Second, it's important to understand the scope of distance learning throughout our state and our state university system. The most recent data indicate that 51% of all state university students, state university system students enroll in at least one distance learning course last academic year. The number of students taking only distance learning courses continues to increase each year. We believe that the count we've got here is 21,257 unduplicated head count, which would be a pretty decent head count enrollment for a campus. The inventory of degree and certificate programs offered through distance learning is also steadily increasing, with some of the largest growth now occurring at the undergraduate level. We now have 60 degree programs available in contrast to 22 in 2006. So 60 from 22 just 3 years ago. Every program, early program development for distance learning focused heavily on master's and undergraduate programs, and we've seen this focus expand into graduate level certificate programs designed for professional development. Next slide. A significant focus of the task force report was on the benefits of statewide collaboration and shared services. Much of this activity is already taking place within the framework of the Florida Distance Learning Consortium, and the recommendations coming out of the task force report are intended to strengthen the consortium's ability to provide this service to Florida's colleges and universities. Now I'd like to ask Dr. John Oper to walk you through some of the key recommendations of the task force. John?
Thank you, President Hitt. As Dr. Hitt alluded to, there were a range of study assignments the task force was given, almost like drinking from a fire hose in one aspect. We had almost probably 10 or 12 major topics to study. I'll cover a few of the major ones. One of the first tasks we were asked to do in the legislation was to provide a definition of distance learning. And there are a number of definitions in use around the country now. SREB, SACS, a number of states use different definitions. We consulted with all of those groups, including the Sloan Consortium for Emerging Technology, and a number of national surveys, and also looked at some reports coming out of iPads in the Federal Department of Education. The task force felt that the best definition and the one that provided the best guide for students was to set it at 80%. So a distance learning course would be defined as a course where 80% of the direct instruction or more takes place when the student and the faculty member are separated by time, space, or both. We also had, in last year's bill, clarification and authorization for a distance learning fee, and the task force went on to say that the fee, the distance learning fee, should be applied to those courses meeting that 80% definition or that threshold. In addition to that, the task force recommended the wide range of activity going on in blended courses or hybrid courses. These are courses where the students are spending part of their time on campus and part of their time in web-based activities or remotely. And we provided a definition for hybrid courses as well as a guide, and we set the threshold for those at 50 to 79% of the course delivered through some form of technology. The next area I'll talk about is the Distance Learning Consortium. Dr. Hitt alluded to the consortium. The consortium has been around in one or more forms since 1996. It started in 1996 as the Florida Community College Distance Learning Consortium, and then in 2003 it completed its merger with the Florida Virtual Campus to become just the Florida Distance Learning Consortium, and now serves all of our public institutions as well as some of the ICUF schools who are engaged with its activity. Last year, the legislation put the catalog that it operates, which is an online catalog of all of the distance learning courses and degree programs offered in Florida for students to search, put it in statute, and assigned its maintenance and operation to the consortium. The consortium has a long history of working with our institutions in shared resources, collaborative activities, and coordinated resource procurement to cut costs in operating these kinds of programs. However, through over the years, it's had some reference in law, but all of those references were eliminated in the school code rewrite and the combination of the systems. So the task force is recommending that the legislature formally recognize the consortium in law and provide some accountability for that operation. One of the issues that received a lot of attention and was of interest to a number of the legislators last year was the concept of online registration. Many of them have seen the catalog. A lot of them have actually used the catalog and searched the catalog. And so the obvious question was, when a student finds a course or a degree program in which they want to participate, what do they do next? Can they click a button and begin the enrollment or registration process? Currently, they cannot do so. There are some reasons for that, but the legislature asked the task force to look into this activity. The task force did some work looking in some systems that are in place in North Carolina and in Georgia, and also looked at some initiatives that the SREB has undergone called the Sloan Semester as a result of the hurricanes of about 2 or 3 years ago. The task force is recommending that this work into the creation of an online registration process be continued through the consortium. It is a very complex undertaking. It involves not only a number of policy issues, but some technical issues as well. All of our institutions do not use the same student information system, so integrating with those would be an issue. There are concerns about would students have all the prerequisites required? What kinds of things would we automate? How do we make sure that our universities and colleges can maintain the academic integrity of their programs through this process? So the task force is recommending that the work on an online registration process be continued and assigned to the Distance Learning Consortium, with it impaneling a work group of the right folks, which would include registrars, CIOs, and appropriate admissions folks from our institutions, and an advisory role to complete that project. The consortium has operated a digital content repository for the last 3-4 years, really. We got into the concept of a single web-based collection of resources that could be shared among our institutions simply because we realized one of the major barriers to the expansion of distance learning involves the cost of adapting our courses and programs to online or web-based delivery. And so the concept of sharing that content among our institutions gathered steam a number of years ago. The consortium has created a repository it calls the Orange Grove. Institutions can search the Orange Grove in a number of ways by common course number or a number of different ways to find resources that they can then use to develop and build courses that they need. As a part of this, however, in the last 2 years, the concept of the high cost of textbooks has now creeped into this issue. The fact that we have a content repository and are putting educational resources in it that can be shared, we also realized that we could put open access textbooks in this repository, and those textbooks can be available for faculty to review and adopt and use in their courses. Currently, in a partnership with the state of California and the Open Education Resource Consortium, we have 45 textbooks that are available in the Orange Grove that faculty members can use, students can download, they can adapt. As long as they provide attribution, there is no restriction on the use of the material. And we have a working group that's exploring working with the University Press of Florida for the production of those books. So students can download the books, faculty can see them on their computer, but if a student wants a hard copy, they might be able to work with the University Press, as we're exploring that, to actually produce a hard copy textbook for probably at least 40% of the cost, or 40% of the cost of current textbooks. This would save students a lot of money if we could get this underway. And currently we have some pilot projects going on at least 2 universities and 1 college. So we hope that that will continue on. Let me turn this over to Richard now to review some of the recommendations on state strategic goals.
Thank you, John. Can everyone hear me okay? What I'd like to do real quick here is talk about the subcommittee that I worked with to take a look at the State Board of Education strategic plan, to take a look at the Board of Governors strategic plan, and try to identify opportunities for distance learning to be used to help achieve some of the goals that were outlined in those plans. And one of the things that we found that there was a lot of overlap when we started looking at the plans, even though there was some more focus on K-12, of course, within the State Board of Education plan, within their post-secondary arena. They had the same concerns that the state university system do, that basically issues of time to degree, issues of degree completion, and also the whole issue of trying to provide flexible scheduling for students were commonplace across both of the systems. And we came up with basically 3 recommendations in that process, and one of them, of course, is simply to facilitate the completion of associate and baccalaureate degrees across the 2 systems. And we feel that, that distance learning really offers that kind of opportunity for students who are enrolled in the institutions, and we've seen this taking place in some of the data we've looked at where students will flex their schedule around their living, around their lifestyle, around their work obligations, their family obligations, and they do so by enrolling in both distance learning courses and in on-campus courses as they are convenient. And this helps them proceed towards their degree at a steady pace. The other thing that we looked at was the opportunities for actually collaborative programming between the 2, between our institutions, between state universities and community colleges, and also between the state universities and the independent colleges that exist in our state. And with the budget crunch that we're all up against, in some cases there might be courses where community college A might have in one of their general education courses online some additional seats that they could accommodate students from, say, a state university that no longer had the capacity. And then the other piece of that would be also there are levels of expertise at the different institutions where you could address some of the critical needs of the state perhaps by taking and having institution A and institution B collaborate on the development of a program. And we've seen this happen in the past with master's degree programs in nurse midwifery and master's degree programs in varying exceptionalities within the education arena. Another area that is definitely of interest, I think, to everyone, and really across the entire United States, but especially in the southeastern states, is degree completion opportunities for adult learners. And we had the opportunity in the summer of 2007 to attend a workshop in Atlanta that took a look at this issue. And the workshop was sponsored by the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning and also the Southern Regional Education Board. And the one point that I took away from that I thought was really important to share was that they made a strong point that the workforce of today is the workforce of tomorrow. That in fact, that those individuals that are in your workforce now who are 25 to 44 years of age are the same people that's going to be in your workforce in 4 or 5 years. And if you want to increase the level of the baccalaureate degree attainment, you need to address those individuals in some fashion. And a number of states have already initiated adult learner campaigns and cooperative degree programs that their institutions participate in, and designing programs that are targeting individuals who have anywhere from 60 to 100 credit hours and no degree. And also in 2007, in a separate project, we were looking at some data for state university system non-completers, just to see, how they were faring in the marketplace. And when I went into this workshop, that it really made me go back and take another look at that data. And what we had found then was that, we had looked at cohort groups for 1996 and up, and found that there were approximately 10,000 SUS individuals who dropped out in 1996, with somewhere, between 60 to 120 credits, but no degree, and they were still in our workforce. And then we looked at a year 2000, and we found another 10,000, and in 2005 we found 11,000. So if you start filling in the gap years and doing some estimating, there may be as many as 100,000 or more state university system non-completers that are in our workforce that are within 60 to 30 credits of a degree. And so to design a program that would go back and get them is something that we have a keen interest in doing. But, of course, that brings up the issue of how do you fund that kind of initiative. And the recommendations coming out of the task force were primarily of a substantive nature. But the other thing we were looking at is that there are some fiscal implications on down the road for trying to accomplish some of the things that have been recommended. And they're relatively modest. The online catalog, for example, needs to be upgraded to accomplish a lot of the things that the legislature has asked it to do, that the institutions would like for it also to do. And the state university system has included in its budget request this year $100,000 towards that effort, and the State Board of Education has also included $100,000 in theirs. The chance of that being funded, we're not sure. The other thing that we have seen is that the Orange Grove Digital Content Repository, as John has indicated, it's really a model for the nation at this point. And it was granted a FIPSI grant to basically develop a template that other states could adopt. And they've been working towards that, but at the same time, the software they're using, they're kind of almost doing it on loan. And what they'd like to do is to be able to buy that software out. And we had been given a price by that vendor for $680,000 to kind of buy it out say it for me, John.
Proprietary.
Professional, thank you.
Oh, professional.
And the thing that we're looking at now, of course, is that we're running out of time on that, and we're looking for alternative ways to work with them and try to at least adjust it down to where it's available for just the state universities and community colleges. But if we were able to buy it out for this $680,000 price, that would include all the state universities, community colleges, independent schools, just about any educational unit in Florida that then the Orange Grove could support. And of course, in going back to the initiatives for the cooperative programs and initiatives for adult learners, the way to get at that would then be to convince the universities and community colleges to work together, but they're going to have some funding, as not just incentive funding, but also to compensate them for the amount of time that their faculty and staff are going to contribute to those kind of efforts. And we would like to, in the future, see some funding for incentive funding for these types of activities. And I would, go on to say that in the Board of Governors LBR this session, we did include funding for the Orange Grove at $750,000. We included funding for the Florida Higher Education Distance Learning Catalog at $100,000, and we also included funding for continuing operation of the consortium at $359,000. Don't have any clear idea of whether those will survive or not. And that concludes that. Dr. Hill,
were they in last year's?
The operational funding for the consortium has been in the LBR for, well, it was buried in the base of USF for a number of years, and in last year's it was funded through the Board of Governors budget, and we have consistently, the board has consistently asked for funding for the Orange Group, I think, for the past 4 years. That's it.
The task force was composed, as I'm sure you know, of personnel from the state university system and the community colleges, and ably staffed by John Opper and Richard did a wonderful job representing the staff of the Board of Governors. So I would just commend my co-chair, Steve Wallace, from Florida Community College up in Jacksonville, and all of the other members of the task force. I do believe that the report is a good summary of where we are and where we can go. So,
but where are we going to go? That's kind of my question. Now that we've done all this, what is there anything that we can do as a board to encourage movement in some of these areas? Money.
Well, money helps. Obviously.
I know, but I look up here and I see that third bullet, incentive funding to get people to cooperate on stuff. That doesn't make any sense. I understand what it means.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand what it means, but
I think if I wanted to just think of one item, Richard just mentioned, if you look at the number of people who are out there in the workforce who have accumulated somewhere, from 24 to 100 semester hours, that's a big number.
Right.
And if we could give that opportunity, if you will, some salience through your strategic plan or through discussion that you might have with us, with the individual campuses of the system, I think that could be something that would be well worth looking at. I would also counsel that we do a little bit of continuing education on our own as to what this whole distance learning operation has become on our campuses. It has become an integral part of our educational delivery system, campus by campus. On some campuses more than others. But you've got, as I mentioned in my remarks earlier, you've got a blend in every one of those courses of students who are taking only distance learning courses and students who are taking live instruction for most of their degree program, but who find convenience in the distance learning courses. Satisfaction with these courses is very high. It's as high as it is live instruction. achievement of the students is as good as it is with live instruction when we have properly designed and delivered distance learning. So it's become an integral part of how we deliver education at all levels, associates through PhD.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of it in the right settings, and I think it's a real good opportunity for us to promote and get a better response from veterans and the GI Bill, because it's convenience they're looking for, and flexibility.
Convenience and flexibility. We should not look at it as a cheap way, financially cheap way of meeting the needs of learners. It is about as expensive as live instruction when you do it properly. Now,
but I also had some ideas that you could maybe utilize if we could get really interested in this collaboratively, that as we look at cutting back on things, that maybe you could take some of the lower utilized programs and pick the best one in the whole system or something and begin to offer that everywhere. And then, we have, we're not destroying.
Yeah. Well, there are some opportunities in that area, I wouldn't doubt. One thing that I guess I would just put in as a caveat on that, Governor McDevitt, is if you look at the size of most of the institutions in our system, they're really big enough so that you're not talking about, even if you take all the low enrollment courses, for instance, you're not talking about large-scale program elimination under any circumstance. And whether it's really going to be the case that you would be picking one program in a field and keeping it and using that statewide, I don't know.
I mean, I appreciate what you're saying. It's just that some of those programs are the ones that always get targeted in political discourse, and that might be a way to
It may indeed.
Eliminate some of that, because I think most of these programs are needed within a university system, because that's part of what it's all about. But
Well, we certainly wouldn't want to overlook an opportunity.
right, I'm just thinking about ways that we can have our cake and eat it too.
But we really have, in the state of Florida, we've got a robust group of programs in distance learning in the community colleges and the state universities, and I'm less familiar with what may be out there in the independent sector, but I don't doubt there's some really good ones there too. And if we can continue to cooperate and collaborate, I think Florida can be a real leader in this whole distance learning endeavor nationwide.
Any other questions or comments? There are just a couple of items, I guess, from the recommendations that I think that I'd like to bring to our attention, and we can maybe have some further discussion on it. I guess one question I wanted to ask you, Dr. Pitt, is that was there some question about whether or not the recommendations on the definition of I guess, distance learning and or, I guess, hybrid blended courses, is there some possibility that that's going to be changed? And I guess I noticed that in my notes that it was USF that didn't agree with those proposed definitions. Did you recall, was any special conversation about that?
There was a lot of conversation about it, and if we didn't get unanimity, I think we had fairly close to consensus on that 80% definition. Richard and John, do you recall it the same way?
We had one that dissented, and that was the University of South Florida. I think one of the issues that we ran into when we were discussing this was that over the years, with some of the universities implementing distance learning and also implementing fees to help them fund it, that they set up different funding structures for their distance learning efforts. And in the case of the University of South Florida, they had used a 50% threshold because that was where the SACS threshold was set for needing to establish student support services and other academic support services for students, and ensure that they were in place. Where the 80% came from was really approaching it more from the user perspective. And from the user perspective, if I go online and I'm going to enroll in what I consider to be a distance learning course or online course, I certainly wouldn't expect to have to spend 50% of my time on campus. And so we kind of got hung up on that for a while, and it was a lot of discussion over that point, and we understood that some of the universities are probably going to have to adjust their funding structure if this definition is adopted by the legislature and the board.
So I guess in response to that, if there's, if you could follow that and if while going through the legislature, if there's any issue with the definitions, if you could just keep us updated and let us know about it in our June meeting, I'd appreciate it. I would also ask if we could look at, I guess, recommendation number 13 on page 50, which actually talks about the Florida Distance Learning Task Force recommends that the classification scheme described in Appendix C be considered by the Board of Governors, Florida College System, and State Board of Education. I guess my recommendation would be that if you could come back to us in June with some kind of analysis regarding this reporting scheme that's identified in Appendix C. I don't know if you have any comments on it now that may kind of bring us up to date on it, but something, I guess, because it specifically addressed the board and asked us to review that and make some kind of comment on that. I think it may help if we talk about it a little bit now, and then we can...
Okay. Well, I can do that. Actually, some years back, the State University System and community colleges both established data elements within their data collection that would try to identify online courses, distance learning courses. What happened at that time was basically that they adopted different definitions. And since that initial adoption for the State University System, we've had to go back again and to redefine things a little bit. And so this will require us to go back to the data administrators. We already had plans to do that in June when we meet with them. We're already working towards new definitions, and the idea is that whatever definitions that are adopted will be adopted by both the community college, Florida college system now, and also the state universities, so that everybody is speaking basically to the same thing. And I would expect to see some of the numbers that we have presented to this board in previous years to certainly be affected as the new definition goes into play, because it's pretty clear that, once again, that some of the universities were using a slightly different definition when they were reporting to us as well. So we'll see some adjustments in our overall numbers for number of students in totally distance learning courses.
I guess another thing I'd ask that we draw our attention to is that the report strongly recommends that the Distance Learning Consortium be established in Florida statutes to develop, maintain, and or promote various collaborative activities. There's recommendations in items 7, 16, 17, and 18 that deal with collaborative contracts and shared services. And Mr. Chairman, based upon that, I would suggest that Governor Duncan's shared services team review these recommendations and others dealing with the consortium to determine action that may be needed from our system to assist the consortium in moving us with the activities mentioned.
Governor Duncan? Okay, very good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are also two recommendations that I feel should be considered by the baccalaureate degree system structured project team. Recommendations 25 and 26. Both of these deal with the incentive funding issue that our chairman had for collaborative and cooperative degree programs. The item that I guess bothered our chair earlier. I know that incentive funding, at this time is something that maybe we find hard to think about given our current condition of our budget. However, there's a question of whether or not this recommendation merits a review and whether or not our project team should determine the resources needed and outcomes anticipated if we were to move forward with these programs. And I guess the question is, that was a recommendation. Do we think it's given where we are budget-wise, should we take a minute and look at what those incentives might be and what kind of funding may be out there? Yes?
Well, I think we need to look at it and try to figure out exactly what we're targeting and what type of incentives we might be talking about. I mean, incentive funding we might be talking about, and what would happen if there weren't incentive funding. Could they cooperate and get some of it done without it?
So there's no kind of looking at it. There's no downside of at least looking at the issue and seeing what's out there. That you never know what may happen with money that may surprise us and come from somewhere that we don't expect.
The interesting thing in this is going to be with the emergence of the state college system. how do you sculpt your cooperation? When it was pretty clear that the community colleges did lower division work and we did upper division and granted the baccalaureate degree, it's fairly easy to see how we would align ourselves to cooperate. I don't want to say that we won't cooperate or can't cooperate under the new structure, but it is going to be a little different. And that may complicate the incentive structure a little bit.
And then finally, Mr. Chairman, recommendation number 6 is for the legislature to consider policies regarding open textbooks being created and placed in a statewide digital depository. We heard in the presentation that we could save students millions of dollars in textbooks by investing funds in this type of depository. I guess the question is, what guidance should we provide staff on this issue? For an example, should we pursue state funding for it for this session? Or should we see if the universities want to support it financially? And basically, where's the will of the committee? So I don't know if you have any thoughts, and Dr. you may want to start out by kind of talking about the conversation about this issue.
You know, I'm going to defer to John and Richard on that. I'm drawing a real blank on the discussion we had as to how we would fund that. And I'll just be honest and not try to fake
I think if your desire is for us to try to get it funded, I think I'd just suggest you express that and then let us try to find the best mechanism, whether it's that there's potential for grants, there's potential we can try to get the legislature to fund it, although we know it's a tough year, or it may be that the universities may all be willing to chip in a little bit. But if you want to, much like the earlier time, if you wanted to see us pursue it, I think we've got a sense of the board and we'd go after it.
Well, I think we heard from the students at one of our recent meetings that this was an idea that they were very interested in.
Governor Duncan?
No, I think with the students, I think that is clearly one of their priorities and the opportunities, and I think we can, however, we can try to all work together to explore those sources, because I mean, theoretically it should reduce the cost if we get this right. And
correct. Yeah. I think we've got the sense of the board, you know, that you're interested in it, the students are interested in it, and we need to try to find the right way to fund it.
That'd be great. I mean, I guess I don't have a lot of hope for doing anything with the legislative session, but if there are other ways we can do it, certainly it's a big enough issue for us to try to explore and find other opportunities.
And the other thing I would say is, yeah, again, there's so many weird pots of money coming out stimulus-wise that, you know, I know there's heavy med, you know, stuff, but there may very well be some weird little niches of grant money that we can go after from that, and, you know, we know it's on Winstead's Day, and kind of staying in close contact on this one in particular might be a good one to kind of gear up a grant application for.
Right.
Dr. Solano?
I listened in on a number of the subcommittee meetings and attended one meeting of the task force and have been kind of watching this on behalf of the faculty. And one of the things that I was struck by is that I believe that this whole notion of distance learning, and Dr. Hipp said as much, is embraced to different degrees on different campuses. Some of the campuses are much more invested in it than others. I think the community colleges on a whole are much more invested than the university system, for instance. But some of these things, I was really kind of blown away by, for instance, the Orange Grove repository. I had been led to believe that this was K-12 materials. I had absolutely no idea until I sat in the task force where they demonstrated it, what was available there and what was available in other things. Through other sources that you could get to through the repository, and they talked about the possibility of textbooks and things like that through the repository. I think they suffer somewhat from a PR problem, because I think faculty would be, and when you talk about textbooks, faculty are the ones who select textbooks. Faculty are the ones who select the resources that are going to be required for their classes. And so one of the things is that we need more PR about what's out there and what the possibilities are to faculty at large, so that they will become more comfortable in examining what's available and potentially using these resources. Then that being the case, I was very concerned by it seemed as though the Orange Grove people appeared to have a staff of like 2 people to me. So when we look at budget issues, all of this is going to cost a lot of money in the long term. And 3 little bullets doesn't do justice to the budget issues, but I'm behind it. I'm interested in getting more engaged in it myself, and I think faculty, those who aren't, would be. For one, there's a recommendation in here about faculty training or faculty development. I think the community colleges, with the exception of a couple of our universities, have good centers for working with faculty, but the community colleges probably do a better job of this than we do. I've never done a distance learning course, and I would not attempt to do it without some training, because it does need to be done right for it to be effective. You don't just go online. You don't just stand in front of a video camera. But I think the faculty would embrace this more so than they are now, but there needs to be a little bit more PR on what resources are out there, and there needs to be a little bit more support for faculty on the campuses to design and develop the courseware and to help them with the technology. So I'm enthusiastic, but yet I do know this is not going to be cheap.
I guess the question I have, when you talk about PR to the faculty, you think that would come from whom?
I'm not sure. I was pushing for our campus to invite the people from the Orange Grove to come and do a presentation on our campus, and I believe that our Center for Instructional Research and Technology, which is staffed by essentially one person and a couple of little peons, was going to do that. But there again, all of this takes personnel, and there's only, it looked to me like 2 of these folks, and if they can't be out traveling around necessarily, if they've got to be in Tallahassee doing their job.
I think there's still a pretty limited number of texts that are available through Orange Grove.
Texts, maybe yes, but you can get through Orange Grove to other sites very easily, and where they have, you can get to some site in Europe where they have materials. You can get to some site up in the New England states where they have materials. I mean, I was just sitting there with my mouth open, not realizing that all of this kind of stuff was available.
I think that probably the healthiest way, and this may have been mentioned earlier, is that in the gen ed classes, where there's maybe potentially more commonality and across all 11 of the campuses, that we may have the really big potential there. But again, I think we need to try to look to see if we can get this funded and then figure out the best way to communicate it to the campuses, what the opportunities are for faculty and students.
Governor Tripp?
I've seen this 12, 14, 15 years. Interestingly enough, the community colleges, when we started this, we really were doing it because we thought it would be a cheaper way to provide it. So I was interested to hear you say it's really not cheaper. Might be cheaper if there was more collaboration. You know, the thing that I always thought that would be wonderful is if you had a celebrity professor, somebody really special in certain areas, could be writing, something like that, that you could put together a program at UCF, and that professor could be accessed by students in writing at the University of Florida, you know, that type of thing. You know, I was excited about the fact that we could use it for star power type thing, and I don't know that we've ever gotten there, but it also sounds to me like maybe it's more expensive, because we're a little slow still on the collaboration. And do the community colleges still think it's more expensive?
Nor, if I could jump in before John responds, I came late to distance learning on our campus. I've described that we kind of have an allergy to it because we think the face-to-face. And because my image of the distance learning was watching a professor lecture in the front of a room like a videotape. And that isn't the way they do it. It's a high degree of interactivity, virtually daily, and that's what drives the cost up, because for the professor...
It's not the technology.
It's not the technology. For what the professor needs to do is to be able to connect with students. And our faculty described that it's actually more work than just going in front of a classroom, because they have to design this program and the exchange, and they can't... Where you save revenue is if you can have the same lecture for 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 students. But you can't have that interactivity and the connections with really more than maybe 50, and each campus may have a different threshold. And so that's where that would come in. We maybe could have someone come in and give a little demonstration, which is what I finally did, to really see what they're doing. Yeah. Sorry, John.
No, the example that Governor Tripp uses is a great one in illustrating this point, because think, if you're going to teach somebody how to write, that's a real-time activity, one-on-one. And you learn to write by rewriting under guidance of someone who's better at it than you are. So to say you've got a star at University of Florida who's going to, or UCF who's going to be accessed by people around the state, well, that's done in real time. The person has to read the sample of writing from the student and give some kind of comment, whether it's by video or by email or whatever. So you're back to the limitation of how much time can a faculty member really give to each student. Yeah.
What some classes do is actually other students are critiquing some of the other writing, and then it just stacks up. What we may want to do is have a demonstration. It wouldn't take 5 or 8 minutes at one of the meetings, and sort of see, because faculty have really gotten clever and creative with this, far beyond what I imagined.
Can we look at the other part, because I did see a demonstration on that in the community colleges, where a professor would be giving 3 classes at the same time and had back and forth at branch campuses.
Well, you can do that. With TV, for instance.
Camera looked at you and they could talk to you.
Oh, yeah, you can do a lot of that stuff. The benefit in all of this really comes down to the flexibility for the learner, and the fact that if you do one class, you don't have to go, if you're not doing it live, if you're doing it really distance learning, you may have 12 people here, 5 here, a dozen there, and you put it together into a cost-effective group. And that, you wouldn't have that at any one site, but at a number of different sites, you put it together and make it cost-effective. But if you're not ready to invest in a lot of faculty development, and in having the instructional designers and web information technology specialists, it's not something you ought to jump into.
And the support,
it's very expensive on the front end.
The support staff.
Yeah, one thing that we've done, we're real heavy into distance learning, is we've worked with the military and with the Department of Defense earmarks and grants, and it's the devices that they can receive their distance learning information, and we've been experimenting very successfully with very small little mini computers. And now we're going to transition to PDAs, whatever people have, and they don't even need to have connections to the internet. They just need to be able to get to the internet once in a while and upload and download, so they can be deployed even in Afghanistan or Iraq or on a ship and continue their distance learning. There's been huge advances made in the medium, the technology, the hardware that is going, and that's been developed. It's fascinating what you can do with some of these devices, especially smartphones.
But you have to have the technology at both ends, whatever it might be. The technology.
Whatever they have now. That's the next phase. Is not to give them a little mini computer, which is half the size of a sheet of paper.
Right.
But to be able to transmit it to whatever it is they have. Smartphone is best, but BlackBerry will work. And they have earpieces and, all kinds of stuff.
Governor True, is there anything else? If there's no further
Oh, I
comments.
have one more question.
Yes.
Sorry. I didn't read this word for word yet, but I wanted to ask about the costs. What did you find when you looked at the different universities for out-of-state students? Do you charge them in-state? Do you charge them out-of-state? Do you charge them another fee? What is that looking like across the state universities?
The information I've seen is that our universities and colleges are charging in-state or out-of-state, if it's within funded enrollment. If it's through continuing education, then you have options to charge different rates, and a lot of folks are doing that. In other states, like Georgia, they have actually established what they call an E-rate, not to be confused with the K-12 internet thing, which is somewhere between out-of-state and in-state. It's the actual cost that they think they need to make that course go. So they've got, and that's been very popular because, and in fact, some of them, particularly for the Gen Ed core, where it's easier to ramp up an online course because you've got that content. The E-core rate has been very popular. So they have one rate for those courses, and that's been very easy for them to do. So it varies, but right now there's a lot of discussion about the funding scenario, not the funding, but the cost calculations of this model right now. That's where a lot of attention is being paid.
So the answer is it's all over the place, and you're starting to talk about it. Thank you.
If there are no further comments, I think that concludes our conversation about distance learning, and that concludes my report, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to thank Governor Parker and Dr. Hitt and Ms. Jones for all of the hard work you all have done in regard to this whole distance learning process as well. Job well done. And we'll be hearing back from the various teams at the appropriate times as we get a little bit more involved in some of these ongoing discussions. Our last report will be from Governor Marshall on the academic programs. Governor Marshall.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this item ought to be simpler and more straightforward than the last one. It has to do with the termination of the University of Florida's PhD program in engineering mechanics, and I can make the case, I think, with one simple declarative statement as follows: the coursework and examination policies for the mechanical engineering mechanics, and engineering science degrees are identical, so that effectively no difference exists between these degrees. Therefore, Mr. Chairman, we are proposing that PhD program be eliminated. Terminated.
Is there a second? Second. Okay, so move a second. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you, carries.
That's it, thank you.
Okay, and on this particular item, we're going to ask for a waiver and take it to the board's agenda, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Very good. Does it require a separate motion?
I think probably so.
Okay, so if you could make a second motion for the waiver and...
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Whatever it is.
Waiver. Take it to the board.
All those in favor?
We have this two-reading rule, and they were just waiving that rule to be able to go ahead and repeal this degree next tomorrow.
No. Okay, with that, Madam Chair, that ends our report.
Thank you very much. I think, given the lateness of the hour, we will pick up tomorrow morning at 8:30 with the Budget and Facilities Committee and carry on in the agenda. As you probably know, the Trustee Nomination Board Procedures Committee meeting was canceled. So we'll just go right into the Student Affairs Committee following the Budget Committee in the morning. 8:30 will start. And if we are lucky, we will be finished by lunchtime.
Excellent.
Okay, and I appreciate everyone tolerating a two-day meeting. I think, as I've look at this, I think during the session, every year, we ought to count on having 1 2-day meeting, because it's worth the time we spent today just to go to the Capitol and to show our faces around. So I appreciate it. Sometimes we also learned a few things today. So does anybody else have anything else?
And you can leave your materials in the room.
Okay, also, you